Hello everyone, I'm going to be talking you through some Inspector Calls revision, and this is going to work in a few different ways. So I do have a few slides that I'll just kind of talk over where they have some key information just to remind you of some character things, some key quotations, some thematic ideas, and then after that we'll be moving on just to have a look at the structure of the exam itself and any kind of key information and hints and tips that might help you when it comes to sitting your exams. So if you just want to have a look at this slide and pause if you want to, this is going to give you some extra information just on J.B. Priestley, the playwright, and some key context surrounding him, with some ideas of how his kind of context, his life might have affected the play. So this is just a nice point for people to think about. So if you would like to pause the video after reading that last bit of information on context and just have a little think about the idea of why you think the play itself might have first premiered in the Soviet Union in 1945 instead of premiering in Britain, which it didn't see until 1946. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to have a little think about that, and hopefully you should have come up with some ideas thinking about the idea that the Soviet Union was a communist country itself, and that matches up quite heavily with the kind of ideals of J.B. Priestley. He is a socialist. Communism's a step further beyond that, but it is quite interesting that he chooses to stage it in the Soviet Union first because of their kind of communist ideals of everyone being equal instead of it premiering in Britain, where everyone's a little bit more capitalist and where his ideas would be maybe a little bit more controversial. So there's a few more ideas just as well, just to think about in terms of context. Again, I'm not going to read through everything. If you would like to pause at this point in time, please do and just read through the information on the slide, and you can come back to that later. So again, this is the slide that I mentioned at the start where these are just some key themes, and I've tried to list some different ideas that link quite well with each of the themes. Again, if you just want to pause and just take in the information that's on there, that'll be fantastic. There is another slide to come as well. So these are the key characters in the play. We have got 2 pages of this. I have chosen to include Edna because everyone does love a little bit of Edna, though she isn't a massively important character. I do think it's important just to give her a little bit of an acknowledgement. So we've got all of the Berlins on this screen. If you just want to pause and you can just take in some of the characteristics just to remind yourself of what each of those characters are like. And then on this slide, these are the kind of characters who aren't related to the Berlin family but do crop up either just as being an important character or do appear at different points. We've got Gerald, Inspector Gould, Eva Smiths, or Daisy Renton, or at a push if you want to say Mrs. Berlin as well. And again, we have Edna as well. So if you just want to pause, take in that information, please feel free. And again, this is just another slide just to pause on if you would like to. So these are just some key quotations that I've pulled out from the text itself. There's absolutely loads of these. And if you do have your own hardback version of an Inspector Calls, which everyone should do, if you actually look in the back of that book itself, you can also find a page that has key quotations for every single character and for most themes as well. So that's a really, really helpful bit to have a look at right in the back of your hardback copies of the text. So I'm going to spend a bit more time focusing on the exam structure itself, because hopefully by this point we'll have a good knowledge of an Inspector Calls and you should be hopefully ready to sit down and focus on your exams for this, just with a little bit of extra revision. So just to remind people, you will be offered 2 questions for an Inspector Calls. You'll have 1 question that talks about a key character and asks you about a key character, and 1 question that will ask you about a key theme within the play as well. For each of those questions, you will only be given a very, very short quotation. It's not like the extract questions for Romeo and Juliet or A Christmas Carol, anything like that. This literally just will be 1 or 2 sentences from a character from anywhere in the play. This question is marked out of 40 as well, and the marks come from all over the place. So out of that 40 marks, you get 8 marks just for using appropriate vocabulary, sentence structures, and for your spag. Now, just to help people out a little bit, in a little while I have got a slide that just shows you just some current common errors in spellings that you might come up against or that you might also be guilty of yourself. So please do take the time to have a look at that. Out of the remaining 32 marks, then, 16 of those marks are for your knowledge of the play and answering the physical question itself. The other 16 marks are focusing massively on context. So you really do have to try and think of this as a set of skills. Talk about the play plenty, yes, and how you're answering the question, but massively think about the impact on the 1945 audience since the play is set in 1912 and the different inspirations that Priestley has taken from his world and injecting into his play to send a message to his audience as they're watching that. So it's really, really important that you are getting plenty of context in there, and it has to be sewn in throughout. You have to have context in every single paragraph as you go through. It does say this when you start and have a look in the exam paper itself. It says you're advised to spend about 50 minutes on this section, which is a really, really nice amount of time. At a push, you could maybe spend 10 minutes, though I certainly wouldn't spend any more than that planning this answer. And then that would leave you a kind of a mark a minute to write out your answer. But you should be looking at least a minimum of 2 A4 pages written out, if not ideally more. And I would say you should at least be looking at writing at least 4 Peter paragraphs that are nice and chunky as well, with 4 very, very different points. So these are the common spelling errors that quite a few people get wrong. It's kind of some link to context, some link to characters. The very first one I've put down is Priestley. Please make sure you're spelling it with 2 E's. So Priestley. That's a very, very common spelling error, and there really is no excuse for it when it comes to writing in your actual exams because his name is literally written above the question. So there is zero reason why anyone should be getting that spelling wrong. If you would like to pause, just have a little look through at some of the different spellings I've got there. There will be plenty more that I've missed off, but these are just ones that I thought of that might be quite helpful and that kind of sprung to mind for me straight away that I've maybe noticed a few times when I've been marking my different pieces of work from my classes. So these are the different types of questions that you can get. So I've got the first question on the left and the second question on the right in the bluer box. At the top, you've got those 2 different quotations. So we've got a quotation for the first question from Sheila that says, I know I'm to blame and I'm desperately sorry. It's simply my fault. And the question attached to that one is, explore the importance of guilty conscience in the play. And again, it says at the bottom, and it always says this for the questions, you must refer to the context of the play in your answer. So that would be a theme question. So you're looking at the importance of a guilty conscience. The second question then, so we know because the last one's a theme question, this one has to be on character. So for this one, we've got a quotation from Gerald that says, I'm sorry, Sheila, but it was all over and done with last summer. I hadn't set eyes on the girl for at least 6 months. And then your question attached to that is explore the significance of Gerald and an inspector calls. And again, refer to context in your answer. So, what I would like you to do is pause the video for as long as you would need to. Ideally, I would try not to spend any more than 10 minutes. Just imagine this is your sort of planning time. Work out which of those questions you would like to answer, or if you were in the exam and you got these questions, which do you think you would kind of radiate towards? And just pause and first of all, just see if you can bullet point some different ideas. So, which parts of the play do you think show us that guilty conscience is important? Or if you want to do the Gerald question, bullet point some ideas for any points where Gerald is a really, really important character and why each of those things are really, really important. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to have a go at that then. Again, it does not matter which question you decided to choose. It can be whichever you radiate more so towards. But I have got a few ideas that I'm just going to go through for if I was answering each of these questions, what I would potentially talk about. So, if I was having a look at the theme of guilty conscience, these are the ideas that I came up with myself. So, just using that quotation from Sheila, first of all, because you should be using those quotations as your kind of starting point to get you started with everything. I've said that Sheila's the first character to truly change because of her guilt, because we do see that very, very early on when she starts to really sympathise with Eva, when she finds out what her dad's done, where he fires her for simply starting a strike, asking for higher wages, and she really does change quite quickly when she realises she was to blame for Eva getting fired from Millwards. I've also said that you could have a look at the inspector since he's hoping to instill guilt upon each of the Berlins and Gerald in order to change their selfish ways for the better. He is really hammering on the guilt on everyone to see if they will break and apologize for what they've done and change themselves as a person simply because of how guilty they feel. So that's a really, really important point. For Mrs. Berlin, I've said that she only feels guilt when she realises that she's condemned her son without realising, but straight away, once she thinks the inspector isn't real, she retracts that and kind of goes back to thinking, no, she's done nothing wrong, everything is absolutely fine. It's a really kind of flash in the pan guilty moment for Mrs. Berlin that shows us she has got the potential to change a little bit, but because it isn't kind of big enough in her, because she doesn't feel guilty enough, then she just decides she's going to go back to all of her old ways as well. So quite an interesting moment with Mrs. Berlin there. Mr. Burley, he never truly changes and he always views himself as justified in his actions because helping out Eva and the other girls who work for his company would have meant losing him money, and that's not upholding his capitalist ideals that he thinks about. So it's quite an interesting one, Mr. Berlin. He fights the inspector every single step of the way and never massively feels guilty about any of his opinions or anything like that. Finally, for this question, then, I've got the idea that Gerald's lack of guilt, because he never does really feel guilty for what he's done to Eva, and I'll come back to Gerald obviously for the next question. But his lack of guilt about what he's done leads him to investigate the inspector himself to try and clear the names of the Berlins because he thinks he's so far in the clear that there's absolutely nothing wrong with him, and he now wants to kind of save everyone else from this guilt that he doesn't think is justified that the inspector is trying to make them feel. So for the second question then, just 4 bullet points for this one. This was the one having a look at Gerald and why Gerald is an important character in an Inspector Calls. So I've said that he's the only person who's interrogated by the inspector who's not a member of the Berlin household, which shows us that the entitled attitude of the upper class extends far and wide. It is a really important point to remember that everyone else is a Berlin in that household. It's just Gerald who's not, who gets interrogated. I've also said that Gerald acts as the son Mr. Berlin wishes he had, as Gerald represents everything that Eric is not. So, arguably, some of the affection shown by Mr. Berlin towards Gerald leads to further neglect of Eric. And if you remember rightly from the play, Eric kind of gets away with a lot because he argues that his dad's not paying attention to him. He says, you're not the sort of father a chap can go to when he's in trouble," because he just doesn't feel close enough to his dad. But Gerald is this person who's successful. He's very business minded. He's a very strong businessman and has this high up family. And he's everything that Mr. Berlin wants from a son. And therefore, Eric gets neglected quite heavily. I've also said Gerald believes that once he's proven the inspector wasn't a real inspector, that life can return to normal and he can once again marry Sheila, which is highlighting that if upper class attitudes don't change, then nothing will. He fully admits that he has had an affair with Eva over the summer when he wouldn't go anywhere near Sheila, but in his head, everything's absolutely fine. The inspector wasn't real, so it doesn't matter what actions I did because they're all in the past. Let's all just move on and pretend that everything is absolutely fine, because in his head, it all is. I've also finally said that Gerald is the only of the main cast to offer Eva anything in the form of happiness. So, whilst it could be viewed positively for this, he seems far more concerned with appearing as a knight in shining armour and a saviour to Eva than anything else. And is an important point. Even the inspector, in a little way, seems to compliment Gerald and say when he reads Eva's diary, he realises she was happy and she just needed to clear her head after the breakup. But he really does like this image, and Sheila calls him out for it, for just loving this idea that he swooped in and saved this woman in a time of need when she was at the palace bar. It is quite interesting with Gerald as well to think about his age. He's closest in age to Sheila and Eric, and yet he's the only one out of the younger generation who don't change. So again, linking to that message of Priestley, it's thinking about, well, not everyone will change. It's going to take quite a big push. So we can't safely assume that just because people are younger, they'll change. They have to realize the consequences of their actions as well in order to get them to change. So, what I would like you to do then is, just as we did last time, I put the two questions that you could choose from back on the board. This time, what I would like you to do is, I would just like you to focus on writing down what key context you could refer to if you were answering either of these questions. If you can, try and stick to the question that you planned out before. I know I've started to hint at a couple of ideas already when I've gone through some of my ideas about the play itself. But just have a pause, see what else you can come up with, and see if you can use some key terminology as well, such as capitalist, socialist, any of those sorts of things in your answers. So, hopefully, that's given everyone a chance to start and link some contextual ideas to some of the bullet points that you came up with earlier. Now, these are taken from the exam board, and these are the different examples of context that they think that you could include if you were given either of these questions. So, for the first question, looking at guilty consciences, it said you could talk about a poor working class woman like Eva or Daisy is seen as cheap labour, and all the characters are able to exploit her because of her social position. So that's a really, really important point that runs through the entire play. They've also said Sheila and Eric represent the younger generation who are open to change in attitudes and social class and welfare. They echo Priestley's message of how we all need a social conscience when it comes to others' lives. Again, a really, really important message he's trying to get on. But think about what I've said before as well about Gerald. Gerald is still young, the eldest out of the three of those characters, but he should have the potential to change, but his attitude needs to change first. And finally, they've also said you could talk about the fact that the play was written towards the end of the Second World War in 1945, the biggest cataclysm in history of humanity. By this time, many people within society were beginning to take responsibility for each other because they had lost so many people in the First World War, in the Second World War. Communities were starting to come together in order to kind of rebuild themselves because they'd lost so much and everything was broken, both kind of mentally and physically. It was a very, very broken time when everyone did need to come together. Finally, then, have a look at context for the Gerald question. Then, the exam board said you could have a look at the idea that the play demonstrates the social standing of men of the period and how position and power were important. Gerald's engagement to Sheila is more of a business merger than a marriage of love. And again, it's that kind of idea of Mr. Berlin talks about how happy he is at the engagement at the very, very start because he can't wait for Crofts Limited and Burling and Co to finally merge together to create almost this superpower business because of how big and important it would become. You could also talk about Gerald's reflecting the outlook of many men towards women and how women were considered as having an inferior role within a male dominated society, within a patriarchal society. The way Gerald keeps Eva or Daisy as a mistress illustrates the difference in gender and class. So he treats Daisy and Eva very differently to how he actually treats Sheila, because Sheila's an upper class woman. There's certain kind of ideals that he has to uphold with Sheila, whereas because Daisy is lower class, he's allowed to take a few more liberties with her because of a situation where she is relying on him for money. And again, Sheila points that out to him as well. Finally, we can talk about how Gerald conveys the double standard held by many upper class men of position through his treatment of Eva or Daisy and the lies he tells Sheila. So, upper class men are supposed to be these people you look up to because they're very respectable, they're very honest, and he is presented in this way, but at the same time, he's a massive liar. He's not honest with Sheila when he's having potentially doubts about the engagement when he meets Daisy instead. But also, and I always point this out to different people, everyone seems to know what the reputation of the Palace Bar is for the types of women that go there. And it just so happens that Gerald ends up in there himself. So it's something to kind of add to make us question his character and whether he is this kind of upstanding citizen that he wants everyone to believe. So that's everything over and finished. All I can say is best of luck, everyone. Please do go back through, pause on all of the different slides, and just take in as much information as possible. And apart from that, all of the best for your exams.